Hello, I'm Liz Hutchison, Professor of History at the University of New Mexico and moderator of today's discussion of the Practicing Asylum Project. Welcome to our webinar, and thanks very much to the Women's International Study Center and the American Council of Learned Societies and Mellon grants that are main supporters of our work. Quickly, the book project that we're going to discuss today is titled Practicing Asylum, a handbook on expert witnesses on Latin American domestic violence, LGBTQ, and mother-child cases. This book is needed because the Academy contains untapped scholarly expertise that, guided by the resources provided in this handbook, can contribute productively to public debates about asylum seekers and refugees, as well as to the fair adjudication of asylum claims in the United States. As everybody gathered here will explain, this multidisciplinary volume brings together contributions from experienced expert witnesses and immigration attorneys to make strategies and best practices in expert testimony available to a wider audience. First, Dr. Gotterman, would you please tell us about the origins of the Practicing Asylum Project?
Thank you, Liz. I have been a professor at the University of New Mexico in the history department since 1998, and since 2010, I have been serving as an expert witness, and I'm now editing this volume on expert witness practice. Now, I started as an expert witness when I received an email one morning out of the blue from an attorney in New York who asked me to become an expert witness in her case. I was stunned because I'm a historian of early Latin America. So I called up my friend, Dr. Tom Davies, and asked him, would I be able to be helpful as an academic in this kind of work? Dr. Tom Davies was the perfect person to call. I've known him since graduate school, and I reconnected with him when he and his wife retired here in Albuquerque. And by 2010, Tom had already worked on hundreds of asylum cases, including the first presidential asylum case for a transgender woman, Hernandez Montiel, in 2000. Tom encouraged and he mentored me in my first cases. The work of country condition experts is important to recognize that we're not advocates like attorneys. We must maintain our objectivity. And what this means is that we contextualize the experiences of individuals through our country condition research, and we offer professional opinions based on that research. We carry out this work through our written affidavits, which are submitted to court, as well as by providing hearing testimony in immigration hearings. Because of the increasing challenges for those facing, for those who are seeking asylum, the work of expert witnesses has become ever more critical to the asylum process. Liz and I interviewed Tom in 2015. That oral history of Tom is the basis of our first chapter in the book written by Liz. Tom mentored and he's worked with many legal advocates and providers and expert witnesses around the country, some of whom are authoring chapters in this volume. Tom has inspired this book through his decades of work as an expert witness. He passed away in 2019. Through this book, we hope to, borrowing Tom's words, create an army of expert witnesses to document the conditions that force individuals to flee their homes. In the course of the last 10 years, I've worked with immigration attorneys, non-immigration attorneys, legal aid society, law students, and other academics who provide expert witness service. I'm fortunate to have met and formed community with my co-authors in this volume. This is a really impressive group because of their deep knowledge and experience in asylum work and for their compassion. Most of the collaborators in this project first came together as a group in a national conference on expert witnessing that Liz and I organized in 2017 at the University of New Mexico. It was at that conference that this book project began to take form. In addition to editing this volume, my contributions to this volume include a chapter that discusses expert witnessing in the context of academia, a chapter focused on practical guidance for expert witnesses, and a chapter that provides an overview of immigration and asylum law enacted by Congress and the authority of the executive to enact procedures and change legal standards that have substantially restricted the ability of non-citizens to gain refuge in the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Gotterman. As editor on the project, it was fitting that you go first. Turning now to the rest of our contributors here, would you please each introduce yourselves and tell us something about your contributions to the book project? We'll go first with Dr. Gabriela Torres.
Hi, so I'm an anthropologist. I have been working on gender-based violence my whole career as an anthropologist, starting with looking at how gender-based violence was used in genocide. I came to asylum expertise when I began to do work on femicide and looking particularly at how Guatemalan culture and society had been changed in the last 100 years to make possible femicide. And this is the work that brought me to doing expert witnessing. I began doing this in 2010. And I, unlike other experts, do work that's really focused only on a single topic, which is gender-based violence, and only on a single country, which is Guatemala. And this is very typical of anthropologists, to be incredibly narrow in our focus and less typical of other kinds of experts. The chapters that I'm going to talk first about the chapter that I'm solely authoring in this book. And that's a chapter that looks at violence within intimate partnerships, marriages in particular, and how the inequalities in gender-based violence, both in Guatemala as well as in the United States, really come to shape women's ability to have a claim for gender-based violence. And so the chapter talks about two kinds of inequalities. The chapter talks about inequalities in Guatemala, the way that women are made to endure violence in their homes, the way that the state disables them from being able to seek help, the way that police don't take their concerns seriously, the way that courts pretty much are unable to manage those cases in the long term. But it also looks at the inequalities in the ways that we conceptualize gender-based violence in the United States and how we think about what comes to be a form of violence and what isn't. And so we tend to use, even in the United States, although asylum law doesn't allow for us to use our own concepts, our concepts pretty much of what actually is domestic violence pretty much pollute the way that decision making is done. We use our repertoire for how we come to understand violence against women in the United States and impose that on top of the way that violence against women is understood in Guatemala. And that's what my chapter really looks at. It looks at these two kinds of inequalities and how they interact in the case of violence against women in intimacy. The second chapter that I'm working on with Dr. Kimberly Gauderman is a chapter that specifically looks at the problem of rape in asylum cases. And what we've found in our practice over the years that we've both been doing this is that rape tends to do two different kinds of work. And in some cases, it actually works to make people's cases stronger. And in other cases, it actually weakens the case, the presence of rape as a harm in that person's story. And this again comes to how, in the ways that we come to understand gender, right? So for instance, when we're talking about some LGBT claims, we have the presence of rape, then it can work to reinforce that claim for a particular harm. But often when we have a case of rape for a woman, that's kind of considered to be something that happens to women, and it doesn't do the same work. And so that's the chapter that I'm working on with Dr. Gotterman, and those are the two pieces that I'm working on. Both have to do with gender-based violence in different ways, and both, in my case, have to do with my area of expertise, which is sexual violence.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Torres. Anna Cabot, could you tell us about your contribution?
Thanks, Liz. I'm an attorney and I work at the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. Before I came to CGRS, I taught in the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic at the University of Connecticut in Hartford. And before that, I represented immigrants in El Paso, Texas, and refugees in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So that's kind of my history. My chapter initially starts out with a description of asylum law and procedure. And while in the expert-lawyer kind of partnership that forms, the responsibility for understanding asylum law in depth falls on the lawyer and not the expert, experts can benefit hugely from understanding kind of a general understanding of asylum law. I will be the first to admit that lawyers don't often describe what we need in the most clear terms in expert reports. And so understanding asylum law can allow experts to be able to form questions to really get at what a claim needs in terms of expert testimony and how expert testimony can support the claim. I think also understanding of procedure is also an important for experts because the process is long and the process is complicated, and it helps experts to understand what the steps will be and how they fit into those steps of the procedure. Then I turn to really specifically to focus on a type of claim, and Dr. Torres was talking about a subset of these type of claims, but asylum claims anchored around gender-based violence, where the applicants come from Latin America. So I look at kind of a group of those claims, and those claims are currently, and for a while, but currently especially, quite challenging to win. There have been new laws, new decisions issued in the past 2 years that have made these claims more challenging and really have increased the importance of expert testimony within these claims. And so I go in to discuss within these claims especially how expert testimony can fit in and the questions and topics that experts can address. Then finally, I move on to kind of the new frontiers of expert testimony in asylum cases, looking at the Trump administration policies such as the Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy, the asylum cooperative agreements, and the transit ban, as well as asylum bars, and talk about how experts can assist in those cases.
Thank you so much, Anna. Turning now, I'd like to ask Natalie Hansen to talk about her own work.
Thank you, Liz. So I'm an immigration attorney in private practice in Austin, Texas. And I've been practicing immigration law for about 10 years. I started in a nonprofit called American Gateways, where I worked for 5 years as the pro bono director. And that's when I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Gotterman, who served as one of the first, one of my expert witnesses for one of my first asylum cases. And then I worked for a couple of years at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, also in Seattle, Washington. And my chapter for this, for the book, focuses on detention, immigration detention, and the ways that expert witnesses can support asylum seekers who are in immigration custody. And so one of the things that the chapter will do is talk about just a general legal framework of immigration detention. Sort of piggybacking on what Anna said, it's really important for experts and can be helpful for them to understand the legal framework of what the individual that they're helping to serve in their expert affidavit is going through. And so procedurally, I'll be explaining immigration detention in the United States. Why are people detained? At what point are asylum seekers detained? Different ways that individuals are detained, whether that be at the border and whether that be through a legal port of entry like a bridge or in an airport, or once they've been already living in the United States, and how they might come to be detained and then seek asylum from immigration detention. There's a lot of immigrants detained in the United States who are seeking asylum, and the process is, while very similar legally to the non-detained process, the procedure and the procedure can be very different and look very different because of the person's just restricted, obviously. And so there are certain challenges that experts can know about, such as how to communicate with a person who is in immigration detention, challenges in knowing about the court docket and the speed that the court docket goes for detained cases, which is much quicker than a non-detained case. The effects of requesting time extensions for detained cases that can be really devastating and result in the person being in jail for months longer than they normally would be. So going through different tips and guidance for working with attorneys whose clients are detained is another important part of the chapter. And then I'll also be looking at ways that experts play a really critical role in supporting supporting asylum seekers in detention who are unrepresented by attorneys. So a lot of times experts can write generalized affidavits that people who are applying for asylum pro se, which means just that they don't have an attorney, they're representing themselves, that they can have access to sort of generalized country condition expert affidavits that can really help their cases when they're not able to work with a particular attorney. So it's a lot of information to cover, but hopefully it'll be good for people to get an overview of the detention framework within asylum law.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Maria Baldini Potermin, can you tell us about your contributions?
Well, thank you, Dr. Hutchison. So I began working in the asylum law field in August of 1990 down on the US-Mexico border in South Texas. At that time, we were in the other refugee crisis, with refugees crossing from Mexico into the US from Latin American countries and from other parts of the world. So I was an accredited representative, which meant I got to try my own cases when our volunteer program didn't have attorneys down there. I also got to work with attorneys from around the country. And then I moved to the northern border in Minnesota and went to law school there and continued to go back to the border. And I've continued to work with asylum seekers ever since. So throughout the last now 30 years, I have seen the law evolve and the level of the burden of proof go up, and the toll that it can really take on attorneys, especially those who lived through the refugee crises in the United States back in the 1980s and 1990s, and now today, as we see the cycle repeating itself with people fleeing the Central American countries again and the worsening violence in Mexico. So my chapter is going to focus on trauma and support for asylum seekers, as well as legal advocates and expert witnesses. Unfortunately, the bar and law schools have not done a great job necessarily of helping law students to train to look out and take care of their own well-being and mental health. And that has finally been recognized within the bar, especially since 2016. For expert witnesses who are training and doing their first couple of cases, at times it can be overwhelming as well. You're dealing with facts involving rape and murder and other forms of torture. And expert witnesses may not also recognize that at times they may need to step back. So my chapter is going to serve as a resource chapter. It's going through some of the terms such as vicarious traumatization, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then providing resources and ways that attorneys or legal service providers and expert witnesses can help to understand each other and to support each other in working on the case together through the trial and sometimes thereafter on appeal.
Great, thank you. We'll pitch this back to Dr. Gotterman for a few more notes on the volume.
Well, in addition to these contributions, our book will also contain a chapter that looks at the history and the practice of gender-based and sexual assault cases in asylum law. And our book will end with an appendix that will have some sample affidavits and then include other resources for expert witnesses.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I'm genuinely really excited about this book. Now, I know your work as attorneys and experts is really demanding, and yet you've all continued to commit to this collective project. Would anyone like to offer a comment on something that has surprised or inspired you about this work?
If I may, Dr. Hutchison.
You may.
One of the things that struck me was how we had our meetings together right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic lockdowns in the United States. While we were meeting, and this was very early on in March, we were lucky enough to have the facilities at WISC to be able to spend time together, to be able to think and deliberate. And in our lives as academics, as well as attorneys, it's very hard to find time to do this under normal times, and even harder post-COVID. As our workloads have changed, the stresses and demands that we've acquired have become really difficult to manage. And so for me, one of the things that surprised me was the fact that we had this moment of a real sanctuary for thinking that WISC made possible. And I keep looking back on it and thinking on it as I've been locked down in my own house, and as I've been barraged with work, and as I've thought through what it's been like for the many people in detention. While we've been in quarantine in our own homes, most of us, there have been people who have been living through this in detention and without very much certainty in their lives. And so for me, it's been something, a touchstone that I come back to.
I'd like to share my feelings. I kind of hearken back to what Maria was talking about. I wasn't representing people during the initial refugee crisis she was discussing, but was working on the border during, well, kind of the height of the drug war in Mexico in kind of the late 2000s. And had this feeling of kind of the desperate need we had for expert testimony in our cases at that point. And this process has really opened my eyes to the desire of experts to get involved the meaning that experts find from this work and the real impetus to kind of be involved in these cases. And I've gained a lot of comfort from the idea that not only are there partnerships between an individual attorney representing an asylum seeker and an individual country conditions experts kind of committing their time and their mental health to the process, but the potential and the power of this partnership between legal representatives and experts, and this kind of movement that can be formed.
I agree with what she said too. And I know as an attorney working with asylum seekers a lot, it's been so nice to get to know on a more personal level of the experts and really feel a solidarity with greater community working towards the same goal to support the people who are fleeing their countries to seek asylum in the United States. And sometimes the work can be pretty heavy. And really, I've just felt a lot of joy in this project and sort of hope, and been really inspired by the other women that you see on the screen today. So I'm really grateful to be have been invited to be a part of the project.
I'll just add to my compañeras that this has been really a process that I have been reminded of the value of the work that we do and the need for community while we do that. And I really hope that this book project fosters more communities around the United Nations, around the United States, and that we can encourage people to reach out to each other in this really important work that we're doing.
And I'd like to kind of bring us all back around to where Dr. Gotterman started the discussion today. I first met Dr. Thomas Davies Jr. through another attorney when I was looking for an expert witness in early 2008 on the issue of gay men with HIV in Mexico. And through working with him on that particular case in 2008, he then worked with me on several other cases that were similar before the immigration court. And it took multiple trips to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and his work was again recognized in a published decision that opened the door for my client to finally, after almost 6 years of immigration custody, be released. And the work that expert witnesses do in our cases will not only help our immediate clients, but they can change the law and go forward and help so many others that are fleeing persecution and torture as we go forward. One thing that I really always appreciate about Dr. Davies, or Tommy as I would call him, every time I would call him, he would answer the phone, "Hola, Maria la bandida," which is "Hello, Maria the bandit." And you get just such a sense of community being together, even across the phone line or now across Zoom, in working together and supporting each other through the really hard cases and through the difficult times. And it was through Tom that I met Kim, and then Liz, and then the rest of our great group here on this project. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this.
Terrific. Thank you, all of you, for those reflections. Dr. Gotterman, I believe you have more to tell our listeners about what they could do.
Well, we hope that this book project will help and encourage academics and legal professionals, and also the general public. If you're an academic, as an academic, you're qualified to become an expert. And I would encourage you to reach out to the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies as a resource to begin your work. This book is also a teaching tool. This is a book that can be used in undergraduate and graduate classes, as well as in law schools, that focus on asylum and immigration, human rights, and gender and sexuality studies. If you're a legal professional, this work will help you train your junior attorneys to work with experienced and non-experienced expert witnesses. And finally, if you are in the general public, this book can help raise your consciousness about these issues in asylum and immigration. And I would encourage you to stay informed. You can do this by contacting your representatives about your views on asylum and immigration. You can also support higher education, and you can support organizations like the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies and the Women's International Studies Center.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gotterman, and thanks to those of you watching. We hope that you found this webinar interesting and useful, and will continue to follow and support our Practicing Asylum project as we move forward with support from WISC and ACLS Mellon. Be safe, everyone. Take care.